2 Kings chapter 2 contains what might be the most disturbing story in the entire Old Testament. 42 boys make fun of a prophet and God immediately sends 2 bears to maul them. On the surface, it sounds cruel, unprovoked, and completely out of character. Skeptics use this exact passage every day to argue against the Bible, and most Christians have no idea how to explain it. But when you look at the original Hebrew text, you realize almost every English translation gets this story completely wrong. They weren't little children, it wasn't a harmless joke, and Elisha wasn't acting out of petty anger. Here is the terrifying historical reality of what actually happened on that road to Bethel. To truly understand what took place on this barren stretch of road between Jericho and Bethel, we have to pull back the curtain on the entire book of 2 Kings. For generations, critics, skeptics, and secular scholars have pointed to these brief 3 verses as absolute proof that the God of the Old Testament is petty, short-tempered, and excessively violent. They paint a picture of a harsh, bitter old prophet who cannot handle a few innocent insults from local children playing in the street, who then snaps and calls down a brutal death upon innocent toddlers. Even within churches and Sunday school classrooms, this story is often quietly swept under the rug. Teachers avoid it, pastors skip over it, and everyday believers are left feeling deeply uncomfortable, wondering how a loving God could ever sanction such a horrific event over something as simple as a hair insult. However, the discomfort we feel when reading this story does not come from the historical event itself. It comes from centuries of bad translation, cultural misunderstandings, and a total loss of the original ancient context. When modern readers pick up a 21st century English Bible, we naturally read ancient Hebrew texts through a modern lens. We project our 21st century definitions, cultural norms, and social structures onto a world that existed thousands of years ago in the ancient Near East. When you strip away modern assumptions and look at the original Hebrew manuscripts, the archaeological evidence, and the brutal political landscape of northern Israel, the story completely changes. You discover that this was not a story about children. It was not a story about a bad mood or a personal temper tantrum, and it was certainly not a random act of senseless cruelty. Instead, what took place on the road to Bethel was a high-stakes, life-or-death confrontation between a solitary prophet of God and an organized, hostile, armed paramilitary mob sent by an idolatrous political regime to intercept, intimidate, and eliminate a threat to their power. To break down what actually happened, we must begin with the language itself, specifically the words used to describe the crowd that ambushed Elisha. In almost every major English translation, from the King James Version to modern translations, the crowd is described using phrases like little children, young boys, or youths. This single translation choice is responsible for almost all of the outrage and confusion surrounding this passage. When a modern English speaker hears the word child or little boy, an immediate image pops into their head. They imagine 4-year-olds, 6-year-olds, or primary school kids playing innocence games in the street. Naturally, the idea of wild animals attacking toddlers causes instant moral shock. But the original Hebrew text tells a completely different story. The phrase written in the ancient Hebrew manuscript is nar katan. To understand what this actually means, we have to look at how these 2 specific words are used across the entire Old Testament. The Hebrew word nar does not mean a toddler or a young child. It refers to a male who is dependent on his household, spanning from late adolescence all the way into early adulthood, typically anywhere from 16 to 30 years old. It describes a young man who is in the prime of his physical strength, capable of working, fighting, and carrying weapons. For example, when Solomon ascended to the throne of Israel in 1 Kings chapter 3, he offered a famous prayer to God asking for wisdom. In that prayer, Solomon referred to himself using the exact same phrase, nar katan. Solomon was not a toddler when he said this. He was an adult king, newly crowned, declaring his spiritual humility and political inexperience before God. Similarly, when David volunteered to fight the giant Goliath in 1 Samuel chapter 17, King Saul looked at David and called him a nar. Yet we know from the biblical text that David was strong enough to fight off lions and bears with his bare hands, carry heavy military supplies, and wield weapons in battle. Furthermore, throughout the historical books of the Old Testament, the word nar is explicitly used to describe professional soldiers, royal bodyguards, elite armor-bearers, and trained military servants. When Abraham mobilized 318 trained men from his household to rescue his nephew Lot in Genesis chapter 14, those armed warriors were called nar. When the princes of the provinces led an army into battle in 1 Kings chapter 20, those frontline combat troops were referred to as Naur. Now let us examine the second word, katan. While katan can mean small in size in ancient Hebrew literature, it was far more frequently used to denote rank, status, or age hierarchy, meaning younger or junior. Therefore, when the text describes a group of Naur katan, it is not describing small children. It is describing a squad of young men, junior guards, or young adults in their late teens and early 20s. This linguistic reality is backed up by simple math and military logic. The biblical text records that 42 of these individuals were struck during the event. In any tactical ambush or crowd control scenario, if 42 members of an attacking group are neutralized, the total size of the crowd must have been significantly larger. This was not a handful of kids playing on a corner. This was an organized, aggressive gang consisting of 50, 70, or perhaps over 100 young men who had marched out as a unit to block a mountain pass. Picture the physical reality of the situation. Elisha was an older man traveling completely alone down an isolated, desolate mountain road miles away from any friendly town or security. Suddenly, from behind the rocks and ridgelines, a massive mob of 50 to 100 aggressive adult men steps out to completely block the path and encircle him. This was not a playground prank. It was an armed, tactical ambush designed to corner a lone traveler in the wilderness. Once we understand the true identity and size of the mob, we have to examine their words. Why were these men lying in wait for Elisha, and what did their taunts actually mean? The scriptures record that as the mob closed in on Elisha, they repeatedly shouted a specific phrase at him: "Go up, you baldhead, go up, you baldhead." To modern readers, calling someone baldhead sounds like a childish, harmless insult about personal appearance. But in the culture of the ancient Near East, physical descriptions, head coverings, and public gestures were deeply tied to honor, authority, legal standing, and spiritual allegiance. Calling someone baldhead was not a comment on Elisha's genetics or hairline. It was a deadly serious ideological attack and a formal rejection of his authority. In ancient Israel and surrounding nations, a shaved head had specific cultural meanings. Priests and prophets often shaved their heads as a solemn vow of consecration to God, or as an act of public mourning and intense spiritual grief over the sins of the nation. Alternatively, in civil society, calling someone a baldhead was a vicious, illegal slur used to brand someone as a social outcast, an escaped convict, a leper, or a traitor who had been stripped of all civil rights and legal protections. By hurling the slur "baldhead" at Elisha, the gang was not making fun of his appearance. They were formally declaring that they did not recognize him as a legitimate authority. They were declaring that he was an outlaw, a fake prophet, an outcast, and someone who had no right to step foot in their territory. They were asserting that he had no legal rights, no protection under the law, and that whatever happened to him on that road would go unpunished. Even more dangerous was the second half of their chant, "Go up." To understand the weight of those two words, we have to look at what had happened just hours before this event took place. Just a few miles back down the road near the Jordan River, Elisha's great mentor and master, the mighty prophet Elijah, had been taken up into heaven in a dramatic, miraculous chariot of fire. Elisha had witnessed this event with his own eyes, picked up Elijah's fallen mantle, and crossed back over the Jordan River as God's newly appointed chief prophet over Israel. News of Elijah's supernatural departure had spread like wildfire throughout the entire region. The political and religious leaders of the country were fully aware that Elijah was gone and that Elisha was stepping into his shoes. When the mob shouted, go up," they were referencing Elijah's ascension into heaven, but they were not expressing awe. They were mocking it with venomous sarcasm. They were telling Elisha, "If your master really vanished into the sky, why don't you vanish too? Why don't you drop dead and go up like Elijah did? We don't want you here, get out of our land or we will send you up ourselves." It was an explicit death threat. They were telling the newly appointed prophet of God that his predecessor was gone, that his God had no power in their territory, and that if he did not turn around and disappear, they would take his life right then and there. This brings us to the most critical piece of the entire puzzle, the location. Why were these young men so terrified of Elisha entering their territory, and who actually sent them to block the road? The text tells us that Elisha was walking on the road heading toward Bethel. In modern ears, the name Bethel sounds like a quiet, holy place. In the early days of Israel's history, in the time of Abraham and Jacob, Bethel had indeed been a holy site. Its name literally means house of God. But by the time of 2 Kings, Bethel had transformed into something dark, corrupt, and terrifying. Bethel had become the absolute headquarters of state-sponsored pagan idolatry, political corruption, and economic greed in the northern kingdom of Israel. Decades earlier, when the kingdom of Israel split into two nations, Judah in the south and Israel in the north, the first king of the northern kingdom, Jeroboam, faced a major political problem. God's true temple was located in Jerusalem, which was inside the southern kingdom of Judah. Jeroboam feared that if his northern subjects continued traveling down to Jerusalem to worship God at the true temple, their hearts would eventually turn back to the southern king, and he would lose his political throne. To prevent his people from worshiping the true God in Jerusalem, Jeroboam built two massive pagan shrines inside his own borders, one in the far north at Dan and the primary shrine in the south at Bethel. Inside the temple at Bethel, Jeroboam set up a massive golden calf statue and commanded the people to worship it instead of God. He created a fake priesthood, instituted false religious holidays, and established state-funded pagan worship. By the time Elisha walked down that road, Bethel was no longer a quiet village. It was a massive, wealthy, highly fortified religious capital built around the worship of golden calves and pagan deities like Baal and Asherah. The entire economy, political structure, and social power of Bethel depended on keeping true worship of God out of their city. The royal court, the false priests, and the city merchants made massive amounts of money from the thousands of pilgrims who came to sacrifice at the golden calf shrine. Then came the news that Elijah was dead and that his chosen apprentice, Elisha, was marching directly toward Bethel. The leaders in Bethel knew Elisha's track record. They knew he was the spiritual heir to Elijah, the very same prophet who had stood on Mount Carmel, called down fire from heaven, executed 450 false prophets of Baal, and exposed the murderous corruption of King Ahab and Queen Jezebel. Elisha represented a direct, immediate threat to the entire political and financial establishment of Bethel. If Elisha entered the city gates, began preaching the word of the true God, and exposed the lies of the golden calf cult, the entire religious economy of Bethel could collapse, and the people might revolt against the king. The rulers of Bethel could not afford to let Elisha set foot inside their city walls. But killing a high-profile prophet inside the city gates could cause a massive public riot among the citizens who still respected the true God. So the corrupt religious and political leadership of Bethel came up with a tactical solution. They assembled an organized unit of shrine guards, royal enforcers, and young temple police, a gang of at least 42 to 100 trained young men. They dispatched this paramilitary force out of the city gates, sending them miles down the mountain road into the desolate wilderness. Their objective was clear: ambush Elisha in the isolated mountain pass where there were no witnesses, surround him, intimidate him, and either force him to flee the country or execute him on the spot under the guise of an unsanctioned mob attack. When Elisha walked up that winding mountain trail, he was not walking into a group of noisy kids. He was walking directly into a planned political assassination trap set by the corrupt rulers of an idol-worshipping regime. Now place yourself in Elisha's position on that road. You are an older man, completely alone, surrounded in a narrow, rocky canyon by over 50 aggressive, shouting, armed enforcers who are sarcastically demanding your death and declaring that your God is powerless. You have nowhere to run, no weapons to defend yourself, and no human army coming to rescue you. What does Elisha do? The text states that Elisha turned around, looked at the mob, and pronounced a curse upon them in the name of the Lord. In our modern understanding, when we hear the word curse, we think of magic spells, personal vendettas, or someone losing their temper and cursing out an opponent in anger. But in ancient Israelite law and theology, a prophet's curse was something entirely different. It was a formal, legal covenant invocation. When God established his covenant with the nation of Israel through Moses at Mount Sinai, recorded in detail in the books of Deuteronomy and Leviticus, he set up clear legal terms for the nation. God promised that if Israel remained faithful to him, he would bless their crops, protect their borders, and give them peace. But God also gave explicit warnings recorded in Leviticus chapter 26. God warned that if the nation abandoned him, set up golden calf idols, corrupted justice, and violently attacked his appointed messengers, specific covenant curses would be unleashed upon the land to bring the nation back to its senses. Specifically, in Leviticus chapter 26, verse 22, God gave this exact warning to Israel. I will send wild beasts among you which shall rob you of your children, destroy your cattle, and make you few in number, and your highways shall be desolate. When Elisha stood before that hostile mob, he did not fly into a personal rage. He did not scream insults or try to fight them with his physical strength. Instead, as God's official legal representative on earth, Elisha formally invoked the covenant law of God. he handed the situation over to the highest court in the universe. He declared that these men were in direct violation of God's law, that they were attacking God's official ambassador, and he called upon God to execute his divine justice according to the covenant promises of Leviticus. Elisha did not command bears to appear, he did not have magical control over wild animals. He simply spoke the legal truth of God's covenant, stepped back, and left his life entirely in God's hands. What happened next was an immediate, terrifying act of divine intervention. The scriptures record that two female Syrian brown bears emerged from the surrounding forest and woods, rushing into the crowd and scattering 42 of the young men. To understand the impact of this event, we must understand the nature of the Syrian brown bear in ancient Israel. In biblical times, the dense forests surrounding the hill country of Israel were inhabited by massive Syrian brown bears, animals that could weigh over 500 pounds, run at speeds of up to 30 miles per hour, and possess immense physical strength. A mother bear protecting her cubs or provoked in the wild was considered one of the most lethal forces in the ancient world, mentioned repeatedly in Proverbs and Hosea as a symbol of unstoppable, fierce judgment. When those two bears burst out of the tree line onto the rocky trail, the organized tactical formation of the mob instantly collapsed into absolute chaos. The young men who moments before were shouting death threats, raising weapons, and surrounding a helpless old man were suddenly fleeing for their lives in every direction, climbing over rocks, dropping their weapons, and trampling one another in a desperate attempt to escape the wilderness. Notice the exact phrasing used in the original Hebrew text regarding what the bears did. The English text often says the bears mauled or tore 42 of them. The Hebrew word used here is baka, which means to split open, breach, scatter, or divide. The primary action of the divine intervention was not a calculated mass slaughter of children. It was a sudden, violent dispersion of an organized mob. The attack severed the tactical line of the ambush, broke the strength of the paramilitary gang, and scattered the enforcers into the woods. The miraculous appearance of the bears shattered the corrupt authority of the Bethel regime in an instant. It proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Elisha was indeed the true, chosen prophet of the living God. It proved that Elijah's God was not dead, weak, or confined to a mountaintop, but was actively watching over his servant. And it demonstrated to the entire nation of Israel that no political regime, no golden calf idol, and no armed mob could stop the word of God from advancing. When the dust settled and the woods grew quiet, Elisha was left standing alone on the road unharmed. The gang that had set out to eliminate him was completely destroyed and scattered. Elisha adjusted his mantle, picked up his walking staff, and continued his journey straight up the mountain into Bethel. He entered